the chance of a Le Pen victory in 2027, given the political landscape, has increased substantially. And this last early election, if anything, has increased the probability that she wins in 2027 rather than decreased it, which was, I think, the original intent behind this early election called by Macron.
Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. This week we're looking at France. Given what else is happening in the world, it's been easy to miss that the country is facing big problems. It has a colossal deficit that threatens its economic credibility. It has a divided government relying on the far right for survival. It was just 2 years ago that President Emmanuel Macron decisively won re-election. But France, like other European economies, has been hit hard by inflation, partly caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it's faced massive debt resulting from spending during coronavirus. Following terrible results in the European elections earlier this year, Macron surprised everyone and called snap parliamentary elections. It was a gamble that backfired dramatically. It left France with a hung parliament, the president's authority shattered, and a minority government struggling to rein in France's debt. It now falls to Michel Barnier, the new Conservative Prime Minister and veteran of the UK's Brexit negotiations, to cut spending, raise taxes, and he's currently trying to push through a hugely controversial draft budget to do just that, all the while holding off France's populists who sense a real opportunity ahead of the 2027 presidential election, Marine Le Pen among them. So we're going to talk about what this means for France and what it means for France's position in Europe and beyond. I'm joined by a terrific guest to discuss these two questions. Returning to the podcast is Armida van Rij, Senior Research Fellow and Head of our Europe Programme here at Chatham House. Welcome back.
Great to be back.
Joining me down the line from Paris is Sophie Pedder, the Economist Paris Bureau Chief. Welcome, Sophie.
Thanks, Bronwen. Great to be with you.
Finally, a warm welcome to Shahin Vallée, a Senior Research Fellow with the German Council on Foreign Relations, who previously served as an economic advisor to Macron. Welcome, Shahin.
Thank you.
Well, let's start with the current situation in France, its economy, its politics, and so on. Sophie, perhaps you can kick it off for us. What is the current state of play?
Well, you used the word colossal, Bronwen, and that was the word that Michel Barnier also used when he gave his opening speech to Parliament to refer to the deficit and the debt. We knew things were going to be bad. The forecast for this year for the deficit was going to be 4% originally. It's turned out to be 6%. That's a massive difference. There's a feeling that things have sort of spun out of control. Nobody's quite clear what the cause of this is. It's a combination of factors, a lot of spending that went in to supporting French businesses and French consumers during both COVID and to protect them from inflation after Russia's invasion of Ukraine have not really been very targeted and have been phased out very slowly. So a huge amount of spending, total of about 100 billion over 2 years on those sorts of programs. Deficit's high, debt's high, nearly 115% of GDP this next year. And growth's been slow. So, growth it's a little bit better than Germany, but not much. It's much less good than it is in Spain. And markets are worried. And that's putting a lot of pressure on the government. So you've seen the bond markets concerned about French sovereign debt. And for the first time, some of the yields on French, it's actually been more expensive for France than it has been for Spain and Greece, which is extraordinary to raise debt. So, as I said, colossal is your word, and it was Michel Barnier's word as well.
And I'm really struck we started this conversation talking immediately about the economy. Is it your view that that is really dominating the politics?
It's the budget that's dominating the politics, because in order to get things under control, that's going to involve a big fiscal squeeze, which is going to be unpleasant for everybody. I mean, it's unpleasant for ordinary people because there are going to have to be some squeezes on, for example, subsidies to businesses employing apprentices, but it will also be hitting big businesses. Huge corporates that are making what are called super profits here are going to be hit with the big taxes as well, and the ultra rich, as they're called in France. So it's the squeeze that's going to hit everybody, and that is extremely difficult for a government that is a minority government, that is a coalition government, to bring about when its own survival is fairly precarious. So I think, yeah, absolutely, it's not the economy per se, it's the budget and the impact that will have on people's personal home budgets.
Shahin, how unusual is this?
Well, the fiscal slippage that you've described is very unusual. What I think is striking is that I think Sophie is right to say that fiscal policy and the budget is really dominating politics today. But what is fascinating to me is that this fiscal position is not entirely new. And the election that took place at the end of June entirely ignored that discussion. So there was not a single word about economic policy during this election campaign. And in fact, the entire issue of the budget or debt was entirely absent from political debate. And in fact, even to this day, there's been, I think, a reckoning in the last few weeks, but you still have a number of parties, in fact, even Macron's own party, the Renaissance, who are objecting to Barnier's fiscal plan and objecting to increase in taxes altogether. So I think the recognition that France has a fiscal problem to address is very slow. I think the Barnier government and this budget is really helping to bang heads around this issue. And I agree that this will be a very important political conversation, and one that I fear is not going to leave France right away, because if we pass a budget for 2025, which I imagine will happen, the fiscal adjustment that France needs to undertake is one that will have to be prolonged and that will be substantial over the coming years, not only over 2025. And in fact, Barnier has now presented a budget that is somewhat misleading in the sense that it allows French people to believe that this is a one-off, that we need to do an exceptional tax on rich people, an exceptional tax on super profit. The reality is that taxes will have to be increased on a structural basis, and spending will have to be cut on a structural basis. And this budget at the moment does not really propose that.
We're just a couple of weeks off the UK budget, and many of the same themes are there. This is not a problem uncommon in countries with aging populations and so on, which have had to spend a lot during coronavirus and the rest of it. Why has this come as such a surprise to French voters?
I think we've lived over the last few years, in fact, since 2020, in a world where fiscal policy was not really a concern. We had massive fiscal expansion financed by a very generous QE program by the European Central Bank, and the European fiscal rules were essentially suspended since 2020. So we're now, for the first time since 2020, for actually this budget 2025, coming back to a new set of European fiscal rules that have been negotiated over the last 2 years, and that will become a more binding constraint on France's, or more broadly on Euro area member states' fiscal policy. So that, I think, is helping the reckoning. And I think the fact that generally we have a higher borrowing cost after a hiking cycle over the last couple of years, and therefore financing France's public debt is becoming an issue that we can no longer ignore. I think when we were in the world of very low interest rates, relatively high inflation, we could kind of ignore fiscal deficits. We're no longer in that world.
Debt is suddenly becoming real for many countries, even possibly at some date the US, but we're not perhaps quite there yet in its politics. Armida, maybe you could just take us into the wider issues that were at stake in this election, because we've ended up with this very surprising result of this government crafted by Macron, not quite what the electorate picked.
Yes, and I think it's perhaps worth looking back to the European parliamentary elections, which triggered all of this, really, which during the campaign, that for those elections, that was really presented as a referendum on Macron and on Macron's policies themselves, which then led to, as we know, the big surge in support for RN and for Marine Le Pen. Taking that to the situation where we are today, we are really seeing that Macron is hugely unpopular with his electorate. His approval ratings has continued to plummet throughout 2024. I think in October, an Ipsos poll found that it was at kind of around 24%, which is really quite low. So there's this kind of ongoing issues and challenges and discontent with Macron. We remember the Gilets jaunes protests, of course, which were about fuel, but that's continued throughout, particularly his second term as president.
And Sophie, what about this point that it's not somehow democratic? This was a point put to me by a diplomat from another European country, saying Macron may get away with it of crafting this government around Michel Barnier, but this isn't the way voters voted, and it's going to rebound on France and on Macron in some way.
There is a real problem here, and it's not that a different party won in the sense of anyone winning a majority. That's an important first point to make. Nobody won a majority, but the party, the group that did come top, that at least came with the biggest minority group, was the left-wing alliance. That's made up of four parties, from Jean-Luc Mélenchon's sort of hard left movement, all the way through to the Social Democrats and the Socialist Party. So it's a very wide, broad alliance, but it's hugely short. It's nearly 100 seats short of majority. So yes, it won. But the problem for it and its voters, I think some of whom are feeling quite disappointed about this, they said right from the start that they wouldn't team up with anybody else in order to form a government. So you've got a particularly odd situation whereby, yes, they won, but they were never prepared to try and form a majority with anybody else. The far right, so the National Rally, came second, but also didn't have a majority. And then you've got Macron's lot, who finally ended up going into a coalition with a much smaller group who came fourth. That's the Conservative Republicans. The difficulty with all of this, I think, is that France has just got no culture of coalition building. If you look at what happens in a country like Germany, where you take months and months and you sit down and you hammer out a very often painfully crafted document that runs to dozens and dozens of pages. And at the end of it, you get a coalition and everyone has to make compromises. And it's not to everyone's liking. You just don't have that culture in France. It's not something that happens. And therefore, from the start, each of these three blocks, which is essentially what the French Parliament has become, this three-way split in the National Assembly, will not talk to each other. And that's the problem. Your underlying point, which is that those on the left who feel, well, hang on, we came out top, and we aren't in government at all in any respect, and you didn't really take seriously our claim to be in government, is something that could come back to haunt the French democratic system as much as anything else, and feed the extremes.
So, Shahin, where does this leave Macron himself? He appeared to be riding high. He was getting all kinds of things done. Now he is sitting on the sidelines.
I think Macron made a very high-risk gamble in calling this early election. And in my view, he had two outcomes in mind. One was that there would be a wake-up moment, and he would end up somehow with a larger majority. This was very unlikely given the results of the European election, but I think he thought maybe he had a chance, and I think he played that game of poker and lost with that first option. And I think his plan B was that if the RN was to win the election, it wouldn't be such a bad thing, because the RN governing France between now and 2027 was probably, in his mind, the best way to prevent Le Pen from winning the 2027 election. And so I think what Macron underestimated was the existence of the Front Républicain, so this alliance of the Republican parties against Le Pen in the general election, that effectively prevented her from winning. What's interesting is that Macron actually didn't call himself for the Front Républicain in between the two rounds. This was organized by his prime minister, Gabriel Attal, pretty much against the advice of Macron. So Macron didn't want the Front Républicain to hold, and it did. So he ended up with a third outcome, which is neither of the two outcomes that I think he had in mind, which is this very divided parliament that Sophie has described, and which puts him in a very weak position and effectively hands over power to the parliament and to government. And that's why Barnier, upon his arrival, has in fact taken some distance with Macron's policies. He sounded open to do some changes to the pension reform. He sounded open, and he has been open, to increase taxes, which Macron and his government, including Gabriel Attal, refused until recently. And so I think Macron has been marginalized to a large extent in domestic politics. I think that the big question is how much does that affect his standing on the European and global stage, and that maybe is for later. But I think what is clear is that domestically he's very weakened, and I think the big question now is the Barnier government a 2-3 year government that can last up until 2027? And I tend to think so. Or is this a very precarious situation whereby we could have a new set of early elections as early as the next summer, the summer of 2025? And I think to me the big question is who has an interest in pulling the rug under Barnier's feet. It's not clear to me that the RN has an interest. Because I think this current situation is very helpful for them. They actually gain respectability. In fact, Barnier has made it clear that he would talk to the RN. He's actually scolded ministers from his government who said they would not. It's a party that now appears responsible. They are not going to vote anything that this government puts on the table unless it's something that is clearly on their agenda, like an immigration reform, for instance. And so I think they will end in 2027 in a position where they can say, look, all of this, the Modem, Renaissance, Les Républicains, Macron, it's all one and the same. They've all governed together for the last 10 years now. If you want something really new, you should vote for us.
Us being the RN, yes. Le Pen's party.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Sophie, just briefly, would you agree with that probably this government can hang in there for 2 or 3 years?
I don't think I'm quite as sure about that as Shahin. I think there's a chance that France may go back to the polls next summer, which is constitutionally the next moment at which Macron could dissolve the National Assembly. Well, the big test is going to be the budget, which is going through this autumn and is starting to be debated in Parliament. It's got to go through by December. You know, the government doesn't have a majority. It needs to pass this. It could force it through with a special provision in the Constitution, which enables it to do that without a parliamentary vote. But that then can trigger a no confidence motion. And Shahin laid out very clearly, you know, in whose interest would it be to bring down the government now? But the numbers are against Barnier. So, you know, these no confidence motions, I mean, there's been dozens of them over the last few years. They don't come up irregularly. And at any point, if both the opposition blocs, so the left and the right, far right, both decide to unite to bring down Macron's government, they could do it. It is a precarious situation. So I wouldn't rule out the fact that maybe Barnier's government can last, as Shahin suggests, until 2027. But I think there's also a considerable risk that it will not prove to be as long lasting even as that.
Just want to add one thing which I think would be important in the survival of this government and potentially in Macron's decision to call an early election. It is the possibility that there will be a change in the electoral law. Barnier has announced in his Discours de politique générale that he was favorable to introducing a proportional voting system. And this has been, discussed for a very long time. In fact, Macron in 2017 campaigned on the idea that he would introduce that, and he never did. So I think if there is a new electoral law that is passed, I think that could be a trigger for a new election. And it would be interesting to see who is prepared to vote for a proportional voting system. The RN historically was always very favorable to a proportional voting system and is a bit less so now that it's on the doorsteps of power without one.
It didn't need one. That's what's so interesting, Shahin, isn't it?
That is a very familiar dilemma, which we've seen in the UK in spades, which is that parties don't want, they very much want one when they're very small. And then if they manage to win without one, they may find the voting system actually entrenches them where they are now without a change. So we'll keep an eye out for that. But Armida, I wonder if you could take us into our second question, really, of what this does to France's role in Europe and beyond.
So, I mean, it's safe to say that Macron, but also Scholz, have been weakened as a result of the European parliamentary elections and then the elections in France for Macron in particular. And that obviously has an impact on the Franco-German engine, as we like to talk about it, in Brussels and in the EU, which hasn't functioned well in a long time, admittedly. But this is particularly important now because Europe faces so many internal and external pressing challenges. As for France at the moment, Barnier obviously has huge experience of Brussels, of the EU institutions. He knows his way around. He knows how to work the machinery of Brussels, and that will be to his advantage. Some of his new ministers also have experience in terms of pushing forward France's policy agenda through the Commission, etc. So that will all help. And obviously the appointment of Stéphane Séjourné as the French commissioner is quite interesting. That was quite an explosive outing around Thierry Breton.
Just explain that for us, for people who've not followed this.
So Thierry Breton was France's commissioner to the EU. He had quite a bad relationship with von der Leyen. Von der Leyen was keen to get him out, essentially. He was quite powerful. He was also quite effective on his files, but he clashed with von der Leyen. So von der Leyen essentially made a deal with Macron to say, if I give you an executive vice president position, will you get rid of Breton for me and appoint someone else instead, which is exactly what happened.
This takes us right into the thick of Brussels politics.
Sorry, this is nitty-gritty EU chat. But why it matters that Séjourné has been nominated, he hasn't yet passed the European parliamentary vote for his new post, is because A, he's a very close ally of Macron, and B, he sits on a huge file, which is industrial policy. And given France has been pushing the debate on strategic autonomy, etc., in recent years, this is really a huge opportunity for France to try and advance that agenda. And in reality, he has oversight over a range of different policies, whether that's economic security or others. We'll need to see whether he's actually able to use that to his advantage. The new structure of the college has been quite conflictual, so we'll have to see whether that's just going to lead to internal conflict or whether they'll actually be able to push France's agenda.
This is a really, really interesting point. I just want to stay on it for a second because it really is one of the choices facing Europe, and that may divide France and Germany even more than just the stalling of the Franco-German engine that you've been describing. So if we look at one of the questions, one of the decisions facing Europe, it's whether to put tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and solar panels. And Germany pretty much is saying, no, we want our trade China to be as good as they've always been. And France is saying, yes, please, lots of tariffs. Which way, or let me put it more simply, do you think there is a clash of philosophies building up at the heart of Europe?
There's a clash of philosophies on that particular subject between France and Germany, but there's absolutely nothing new about that. I mean, I think that's been one of the source of frustrations in France, at any rate, which wants to have these tariffs and has got a very strong sort of strategic autonomy agenda wanting to build cars that are entirely based on European components, right from, the electric batteries built in France or wherever, all the way through to the finished product. That is what France has been all about. Germany does a huge amount of trade with China and wants to keep it that way. So doesn't want to put itself at risk of too many retaliatory measures. I think that what I think is interesting in this relationship is that we've just got at the moment two leaders who represent countries that have always had quite different visions of the world, of Europe, of policy, on a huge number of things, from nuclear power to, defense, where you buy your kit from. And they have always in the past had difficulties and then managed to overcome them because the two leaders have worked hard at making that relationship constructive and functional so that they can overcome those differences. And what we have at the moment is that relationship breaking down. That's the problem here. It's not that the two, France and Germany, don't agree. Their starting point often is that they disagree. It's the ability to come together and work through those disagreements and find some kind of compromise. And that's what we're not getting at the moment, at least not on as many things as they ought to be. And there is a sort of absence of leadership on Europe. And I think that's where, things have moved so fast, at least in France, in terms of the sort of weakening of Macron's ability to push that agenda. Just back in April, May, he was still, giving speeches about the future of Europe and, the cover story we did with him on his sort of vision for Europe. All of that felt still very credible. That was only a few months ago, and things have moved very fast. And in Germany, they're going to move faster still as we head into the election next year. So I think that is the problem at the heart of Europe at the moment, is whether or not the two leaders can make in a sort of outgoing year for Scholz and a weakened year for Macron, make that relationship work to overcome those kind of differences.
Shahin, you're nodding. Do you think they can make it work?
No, I think the window for making it work is behind us now. And with the elections in Germany, I think the ability of Scholz to dedicate time and energy to improving the relationship is behind us, sadly. So I think we're going to spend at least a year until a new German government is established without real Franco-German dialogue and without real Franco-German progress. It's interesting, you've mentioned tariffs on EV. There was actually a vote in the council last week that pitted essentially France against Germany. Germany had been fairly inactive around this issue, and over the last 3 weeks, started really to try and lobby against the Commission proposal for tariffs on EV, and Germany failed eventually. On defense, I don't see great room for a breakthrough either on the Franco-German combat aircraft project or on the Franco-German tank project, both of which are really stalling, if not entirely falling apart. And so I don't see really an area where France and Germany could come together before the German election. And then after the German election, France will probably be itself focused on the upcoming election in 2027. And so my fear is that we are going to spend the better part of the next 2 years, essentially, pretty much in an entirely frozen situation when it comes to the Franco-German alliance, which doesn't necessarily mean all of Europe is going to be paralyzed. I think that will offer an opportunity for other countries to lead in some areas. I think Spain, for instance, has been able to put proposal on the table. And I think more importantly, it will, I think, greatly empower the Commission president, because in that sort of power vacuum, she will be the one who will be able to drive the show, in particular on issues like trade, which are, clearly responsibilities of the European Commission, and where member states have limited room to change course. So I think it's probably von der Leyen's moment, the fact that France and Germany are going through this difficult period.
And Armida, what are the kind of things that she ought to focus on if France and Germany together can't agree? There's some big questions out there, aren't there?
So for the European Commission, I mean, she's made it very clear that, you know, the big priorities for her second term are security and defence and enlargement, and probably the third one is competitiveness and the economic growth agenda.
It's interesting. You don't mention migration in there.
No, I don't, because during the last term of the Commission, they concluded, they're finally agreed on the new pact on asylum and migration, which is going to start being implemented in 2026. Some are already, including in France, are already calling for it to be reformed, in the Netherlands as well, and they want stricter migration rules. But I wouldn't say that that's one of the top three priorities for the Commission. It is really focused on this huge competitiveness issue. We've seen the publication of the Draghi report, which tries to look at this and try to propose solutions for it. There was a single market report by Enrico Letta earlier this year, which again ties into all of this, and a defence and security space, which is absolutely essential. And that's really one of the areas where, to Shahin's point, the Commission has pushed into, particularly in the defence space. They proposed a European Defence Industrial Strategy. They are going to publish a white paper on defence within the first 100 days of the new Commission term started. So they're really trying to push into that space. The problem is that they're not putting money towards it. They're not putting serious funds towards it. And given how some of the more frugal countries like Germany, like the Netherlands, like Denmark and others feel about joint borrowing, joint debt, etc., the Commission may well struggle to actually make progress on this. But yeah, so those are the kind of key three priority areas, really.
And let's just come back to the 2027 election, which Shahin mentioned. Macron can't run again. He's had his terms. Shahin, what do you think we should? What are the options? I'm not going to put you on the spot and say who's going to win, but what are the options?
I mean, what's clear, unless she's barred from running, there's an ongoing trial about the financing of her party that could affect that. But it's clear that Le Pen will be running, and I think is in the leading position. Edouard Philippe, the former prime minister, has announced that he would be running. Gabriel Attal is likely to be running as well. Maybe Barnier, by then, if he survives, could be in a position to run. So we would have a very divided sort of center-right landscape. And on the left, it's pretty unclear, and that depends also a bit on what we discussed earlier about the proportional voting system. If there is a proportional voting system introduced, I think that sort of breaks down the alliance of the left, and we may have several candidates of the left running for president. If the Front Populaire, this alliance of the left, survives, at the moment, it seems that it is dominated by Mélenchon, and so it's hard to imagine an alternative candidate, even though that will be to the dissatisfaction of many in this coalition. And so the question is, can any of these candidates defeat Le Pen in the second round? Maybe a centrist figure like Edouard Philippe can, but it's not even clear. So my fear is that the chance of a Le Pen victory in 2027, given the political landscape, has increased substantially. And this last early election, if anything, has increased the probability that she wins in 2027 rather than decreased it, which was, I think, the original intent behind this early election called by Macron.
I think that was the intent. You're absolutely right, and it didn't come off. So if you're just going right back to the economic problems, which you were listing for us at the beginning, and the significance of this budget, is it your sense that a tough budget or two, I'm thinking as well of the UK budget, a tough budget or two could dispatch these problems, or at least make them a lot better? Or is this really something, it's a generational problem for France to work its way out of?
I think the question is political management of this, to be honest. It's really just so difficult for Barnier. You know, who would want to have that job?
Only people who want to be president, maybe.
Well, I think that was an interesting addition to Shahin's list of potential future candidates. He's 73 years old. And he, you know, I think in some respects appealed to Macron as a nominee for prime minister because he didn't look like someone who had presidential ambitions, unlike Gabriel Attal, his former pick, who clearly does, and in some ways went on to outshine Macron. I think that Barnier, he meets the moment in the sense that I think the French just want some sort of calming down of everything. There's been completely hectic and sometimes really unpleasant politics over the last three months or so. And I think that the French just want somebody who's a little bit that sort of grandfatherly figure, which he has come to be in France. And he's clever, Barnier. He talks always about his mon pays. He talks about his country. And when he talks about that, he doesn't mean France. He means the Savoie, the Alps, the mountains where he comes from. And so he's sort of pitching himself as very much this figure who's not a Parisian member of the elite. Anyway, your questions about the economy, and I think it's just going to be incredibly difficult for him. All countries are facing problems where, they have huge spending needs and difficulty financing them. The UK is no different to France in that respect. How you finance them is extremely difficult if you don't have a really dynamic economy. And France's economy has done better than Germany's, for example, surprisingly. It didn't go into recession, unlike Germany's, but it doesn't have the dynamism it needs in order to give France the sort of, maneuvering space to be able to get its finances in order without making it very painful for people. And that's where Barnier's problem is going to be. He's reasonably popular, not as popular as he was when he stepped into the job in September, but he's reasonably popular. But that is unlikely to last as this budget goes through and people start to feel that everyone's being hit in some respects in it.
And finally, let me just ask you, Shahin, how is the conflict in Gaza and Lebanon now playing in this? Is it of a lot of political controversy and weight?
Yes, it is. And I think it has played a very significant role in the last election, in the sense that there is basically in French politics today only one party that has been very vocal and very adamant about supporting the cause of Palestinians in Gaza, and that has been the France Insoumise. It has, as a result, suffered in part because also of mistakes on their part. It has suffered accusations of anti-Semitism. This has been a very important vehicle for polarizing debates around these issues, and I think has greatly helped to portray the French politics as divided between two extremes, the far right on one hand and the far left on the other, which is a relative novelty in French politics, in the sense that in French politics there was one extreme, and it was the far right. And even though we had far left parties for a long time, they were always considered sort of part of the Republican arc. I think the Gaza conflict has really helped, and I would say been instrumentalized, to create a double polarization and to basically push out La France Insoumise from the Republican arc. And I think this is an important change that was not present in French politics before the war in Gaza, and which I fear may stay for a long time now. So I think the war has had very important domestic political consequences, and to some extent has contributed, I think, to Macron's decision to not name a left-wing prime minister, because a left-wing prime minister would have meant LFI ministers. And I think this was something that would have been very polarizing. So no, I do think, even though the war itself hasn't been discussed so much, I think in the background it has played a very important role in creating new divisions and fragmenting the arc, the Republican arc.
Really interesting point. And Armida, briefly, the other headline war in Europe, Ukraine. What does France's predicament at the moment mean for that?
Macron has continued to be a very vocal supporter for Ukraine, and I say vocal rather than material, because actually France has lagged significantly behind some other European countries in material support for Ukraine. But what we have seen already is there was a bilateral security pact signed between France and Ukraine, which promised about 3 billion euros in military aid for Ukraine. That has already been reduced to 2 billion in support for Ukraine because of the various budget negotiations, etc. So that is already being felt. I think the other thing that we need to remember is how close Marine Le Pen is to Russia and is to Putin. I mean, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs publicly supported her in the French elections. So having RN hold hostage the Barnier government over anything when it comes to the budget, etc., is actually a huge problem for Ukraine going forward. Of course, foreign policy and foreign affairs remains the prerogative of the president, so Macron will continue to be very supportive. There's also continuation in the armed forces minister, who is the same person, so that signals continuation. But in terms of actual material support, that may become more difficult.
On that, we're going to have to stop. We could have gone on an awful lot longer. I just want to leave us at the end of this conversation with a clip driven by one of our discussions about the US election, now also just a few weeks away. And that was our conversation with Nancy Pelosi the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, who came to Chatham House, and I asked her about the consequences of the US election for America's allies. This is what she had to say.
Well, the former president of the United States has made clear his lack of respect for NATO, his lack of respect. What has he said about Ukraine? If Putin prevails and goes into other countries, if they haven't paid their full, what he considers to be what they should for their defense, then have at them. I mean, really? The president of the United States saying that? So there is reason to be concerned about what he says and believe him when he speaks, because that's just the beginning of what he may have in store. So when I'm hearing your people say to me, do Americans know how important the presidency is to the rest of the world in terms of America not only assuming but respecting its role as a key power for democracy in the world?
We're going to have to leave it there. If you want to hear more of that conversation with Nancy Pelosi, do go to chathamhouse.org, and you can find lots more there from an incredibly busy week at Chatham House, including our discussion with Valery Zaluzhny, the former commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, now the ambassador in London, as well as Annalise Dodds, UK development minister, and that's in the run-up, obviously, to the UK budget. Clips of all those conversations on our social media as well. But for now, huge thank you to my guests, Shahin Vallée, Armida van Rij, Sophie Pedder. Do follow them all on X. The details are in the show notes. And do follow us and like and subscribe and leave us a review. With busy weeks ahead internationally and at home, goodbye for me, Bronwen Maddox, just for now. See you next week.